Welcome to Positive Philter with your host, Philip Wilkerson, a podcast that focuses on friends, family, health, and career, with a little self-help along the way. Please join me in this journey for self-improvement, and I hope what I have to share will make you a better person, thus making the world a better place. I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and people. This is Philip Wilkerson back with another episode of Positive Philter. I'm joined by a special guest. Well, everyone's a special guest. One, because they take their time to join me on my show. I am joined by Miss Rachel Wernicke. I'm definitely the worst at pronouncing last names, but at the same time, I definitely just called her Rachel all the time. So this is the first time I have her formally on my podcast. I've been drawn to this wonderful leader, not only in our work in higher ed, but also in her space about mental health and well-being. And I just, I see what she's doing, and I've definitely wanted to have her on the podcast to especially talk about mental health, because I think it's crucially important, especially in these times that we're living right now, and just the work that she's doing in general and motivating people. So before we get into this episode, Rachel, why don't you give the listeners a little bit background about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here, Phil. This is such a treat and a privilege to talk with you in this way. So in terms of mental health, I'm a psychologist by training. And so that is, I've been practicing psychology for a number of years in private practice, in counseling centers, in higher education. I've worked in hospitals. Prior to that, though, I was an officer in the United States Army, and that's actually where I developed some interest in leadership. And so I actually combined psychology and my interest in leadership now and some leadership coaching. And so that's kind of what I'm doing professionally. And then just sort of to round out me as a person, I actually am from this area in Northern Virginia where we're talking, and I'm a mom of 3 kids, and psychology sometimes comes in handy there. But yeah, that's a little bit.
I think it's great. And so I know I am not your first podcast guest appearance. I see you making the rounds. And I definitely listened to another podcast you're on. I guess the Indigo podcast was really well done about leadership and also positive self-talk. And I was like, wow, this is definitely something that aligns with my values and aligns with what I try to do for myself. But also I just wanted to kind of get you on the podcast to speak about that. So, in regards to, just the nuts and bolts of it, what does, positive self-talk mean to you?
Right. So positive self-talk, it's interesting when we talk about positive self-talk, as opposed to negative self-talk. In a way, I think we have to be careful about it, because I think when we talk about positive self-talk, what we're really trying to do is talk about how are we talking to ourselves in helpful ways, ways that will motivate us to continue to go on our path and to meet our goals and to live our life that's, in the direction of our values. I do think sometimes, though, that we can, just to throw in a little bit of caveat, we can disregard some types of self-talk that might not be considered positive, but they might also still have value.
Okay. So, the thing that was blaring to me was that when it tips over, and I've been more recent to this term called toxic positivity, where it's like the intentions of being positive is good, right? But then it's not helpful. As you said, it tips over. In regard to talking to someone else, that mindset, that toxic positivity, talking to someone else. Do you believe that that's kind of like the same? That could that be something that we also need to be mindful while we talk to ourselves? That quote quote toxic positivity, where it's like just get over it, or you'll be all right, kind of thing, where the intention is supposed to be positive, but at the same time it disregards or does a little bit of damage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind. There's some great work out there. Susan David's doing some of that with emotional agility, where I think that there's pressure in our culture to be positive, even if we don't feel well. And so we can say things like, I'm just so grateful, because we know that gratitude is something that people appreciate hearing about right now. But what happens if we're saying that in a moment when we're not actually feeling grateful, when we're feeling grief or we're feeling sadness or anger, and we don't honor those feelings? we don't want to live in those feelings for too long, but we also don't want to disregard them by overly focusing on positive experiences, and then we disregard how we're actually feeling. So I think that, yes, positive self-talk is super helpful, but not at the expense of our authentic experience.
I love that. And that's actually great, like authentic experience. So, as a practitioner, and I think, we talk about recognizing feelings. I think one of the best parts about feelings that I've learned through counseling is being aware of them. So how do you take notice and check yourself in regards to that space of feeling where, like, okay, like I am sad, and then but I don't want to sit in it too long. And I know it's a very there's no prescription for it, but like how do you assess those negative feelings and when to sit in them and when to kind of get yourself out of them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit tricky, but I think you said a couple things in there that are really interesting. One is, how do we notice them, which could be a whole conversation for us, just in terms of how do we pay attention to our feelings and how can we be mindful of them and notice, their impact on us. But in terms of what to do with negative feelings and whether we're dwelling in them too long, I think that we just want to be mindful that we're not missing opportunities around us for actually noticing joy and positive experiences when they're around us. We don't want to be caught up in ruminative patterns. That is, when we're essentially kind of like knocking our heads against a brick wall with negative thinking. I think we need to honor grief. We need to honor trauma. We need to honor sadness. We need to honor all of the feelings that feel uncomfortable. And then at some point, we need to be able to figure out, and sometimes we have to get help to do this. We have to figure out, okay, now how do we move from honoring these feelings to what am I going to do next? How do I take the next step to following the path that is, my purpose in life, so that we don't stay stuck?
Oh, so wow. So yeah, I've really planned out a lot of scenarios where I was able to sit in sadness or sit in terrible situations, but then as I honored them, channel it into like action, like even negative emotions into action, like for instance, anger into punching bag, like like things like that. So do you think that in a form of honoring negative emotions is turning it into like tangible action that like is helpful? Is that a way to honor the negative emotions?
For sure. I mean, actually, in one form of therapy that's called dialectical behavior therapy, we think of the function of emotions. So one of the functions of anger, which sometimes people label as a negative emotion that we should avoid, but actually one of the functions of anger is that it shows us that possibly a boundary of ours has been crossed, or that we need to assert ourselves in a particular way. And so if we're angry, that means that possibly we need to speak up about something. And so it's not that it's a bad emotion per se, but if we dwell in it, or if we act on it in a way that's harmful, then it's not great. But if it tells us we need to do something that's actually honoring our own autonomy and our dignity, or that of somebody else, then it's functional and useful.
Yeah, that kind of, I'm thinking about that functional and useful, like for like things like grief, like when like sometimes the biggest champions of grief are people that experience grief. Like someone that lost someone, then they like start a campaign for like whatever they lost someone for, to channel that grief into that action. I don't know. I came across. That's what I was thinking in my mind in regards to like that honoring. So being a counselor, I was very familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT. What is the main? I mean, I guess they're both BTs. What's the difference between CBT and then DBT, as you just explained?
Sure. Well, so cognitive behavioral therapy is a really effective evidence-based therapy that helps people understand the interplay between their thinking and their feelings and their behavior, and how that influences how they operate in the world. It's useful for in treatment of depression, anxiety, and so many different kinds of mental health issues. Dialectical behavior therapy was initially developed to treat self-harm behaviors, and it is based in CBT, but it's actually been shown to be effective in the treatment of other disorders and other issues as well. But I think there are some really interesting components to it that are a bit different. For one thing, in the world of DBT, there are skills that are taught, specific skills. One type of skill is mindfulness, which is how do we, well, I could talk a lot about that, but how do we pay attention in an intentional way without judgment to what we're doing now so that we can make purposeful decisions about what to do next in the next moment. It teaches how do we regulate our emotions and how do we tolerate distressful emotions and how do we interact in relationships effectively. So there are specific skills taught. It also, the dialectical piece is kind of interesting because it teaches us how to think in ways that don't conform to either or black or white. So it teaches us to value kind of the both and of thinking and contradictions. So there's some kind of special components to DBT.
And so what do you think is, I love that, and this is something new. What do you think is the overlap between that positive self-talk and this theory? Is it like recognizing, almost, when I'm hearing the word dialect and what you're saying, I'm hearing almost like a conversation too. Like you're having a conversation with yourself where you analyze yes and you're kind of going back and forth with yourself in a dialogue. And maybe that self-talk plays a thought into that theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, you have to notice that you're thinking, right? So that's where the mindfulness comes in, that I'm having this thought that may or may not be helpful. So there are a couple of dialectics, a number that are valued in DBT where we can make a link with self-talk. So one of them is around crisis and opportunity. So when we are in a situation that feels like a crisis, we can have all kinds of make assumptions or have interpretations about it, like this is the worst thing in the world that's happening to me, or I will never be able to do anything because of this bad thing that's happened to me. But what if we at the same time see crisis as an opportunity? And that's the dialectic, crisis and opportunity at the same time. So yes, this terrible thing, whatever it is, has happened to me, but is there some way in which it's opening up a new path? Now, that's not a suggestion we want to make with somebody who's in the midst of the crisis, because that will feel invalidating. It sounds a lot like, telling somebody to look at the silver lining. But eventually, can we see that sometimes a crisis can open up new opportunities?
I was about to say that too, because probably, in this toxic positivity thing or whatever we're thinking about, I think that the most difficult situations of people's lives, in the moment, you do not want to say, you'll look back on this and smile or whatever and reminisce. Right. But I even when I've journaled or even when I've reflected, maybe as time has passed, I have realized that second part where, wow, this would not have happened if this terrible thing did not happen. So then you do see not the silver lining, but you do see that opportunity later. But I definitely agree with you that like in the moment, that probably wouldn't be very helpful. It takes time and reflection and life and maybe a couple good things that happen afterwards to make you realize that was a good opportunity. So I was thinking while we're doing that, I think this is totally aligned. Like, while we're navigating difficult situations and we're having that dialogue of seeing this as an opportunity, I'm trying to think like, and this might be just me thinking right now out loud on this podcast, is like, how do we still like recognize, like, I like to still think of it in the moment as an opportunity. And I also I don't know, I'm trying to really, really actively work on being supportive of people that are going through grief, because I've had some friends go through some recent grief during COVID, and have that line of empathy and compassion. But also I see them, when I see them doing things that are actually opportunities, like, wow, they actually have channeled this into a positive thing. How do you like just balance being a really good cheerleader to someone else as well as not disregarding their pain and their hurt?
Wow. I think the way you're talking about it suggests to me that you are balancing that, because I think that what I feel anyways, that the secret is in paying attention to the individual sitting in front of you, because there's not like a magic moment that's true for everyone where the crisis turns into an opportunity. So I think you really have to pay attention to what is this person experiencing in front of me and what do they need. If they are really still in the depth of their feelings around grief, then likely they're not in that moment going to appreciate when I suggest an opportunity. Probably what they need is for for me to be able to sit with them and be able to tolerate what they're feeling. But I have to be closely attuned to what's happening and listen for, the openings for when they are kind of going in that direction and they might be willing to see a different direction. Now, sometimes people have to be nudged in that way, but I think that it's really about paying attention to what is the capacity of the person sitting in front of you that you want to just be really empathic with and stay with them where they are.
And I love it. And I was also thinking about the overall the training of the mind, right? And so I think that you being a practitioner over time, I think you sharpen your mind. Is so like, how do you think people actually get better at self-talk or stronger at it? How they build up that resiliency? What tips do you think, like tangible ways that you've seen people do it and get better at it?
Well, there's some great, practices that are embedded in different forms of therapy. I know I've described DBT to you, but another form of therapy that I think is really helpful, and there are actually a number of self-help books around it, is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And embedded in that form of therapy, there are a number of different components, but one of the components is mindfulness, which I know I've mentioned before, because one of the ways that you get better at self-talk in terms of becoming more effective and helping yourself along with your self-talk is just to notice, as I mentioned, that you're actually talking. We don't do that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why in CBT we call our thoughts automatic thoughts, because they happen without our intentionally having them happen. So we have to actually make space to step back and notice that they're happening and notice any patterns or habits that we have around our thinking, because we often do have those. And then once we notice those, then we can ask ourselves the question, is that a particularly helpful thinking habit that we have or not so much? And we can't always change the content of our thinking. Like, we can't just say, well, that's a bad thought, so I'm going to replace it with a happy thought, because sometimes our most persistent thoughts, aren't always so helpful or happy, but we have to learn a different way to relate to them. And I'm pointing to my shoulders because I do think of kind of like the devil and the angel on your shoulders. Like, we can't always get rid of these, but we can learn to relate to them differently. And I can pay attention less to the unhelpful thought over time, as long as I notice it, and start to strengthen my relationship with the more helpful thought intentionally. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but it's a lot about noticing your thinking and then shifting your relationship to the thoughts.
I like that. I feel like obviously over time, one gets louder than the other. Does not mean it completely poof goes away. It just loses its volume.
Exactly. And I use that metaphor all the time in terms of volume, like radio static. Sometimes, because we all have these days when our thinking that is maybe more depressive or anxious is kind of loud, and it's sort of like, a radio static, and we can't control the volume. And we just have to learn how to pay attention to the rest of the world, despite the fact that this static is really loud. And some days, and those are great days, when that static is low.
Yeah, I was actually, to be transparent, I remember one time where I think I went through, very, serious anxiety and whatnot. And I think the I could describe it now was that I didn't have the dial of that anxiety, those negative thoughts or that worry. I couldn't turn it, I couldn't turn the volume off. It was just perseverating. And now that I realize it, now that I'm out of that space, it doesn't mean that anxious thoughts never exist again. I still have, worries or things like that. It just wasn't as loud, or I feel like I could be like, okay, stop. And I think some people I think the point where people probably need some help is if it really does not it doesn't go away on its own, without some, real help or intervention. And I thought about that, what's the line between, okay, I'm really sad right now, or this is actually something where I need to address with some real mental health issues. Because, I think we all experience sadness, but then there's a difference between, in my mind, sadness and then depression. We all worry. I think there's a difference between worry and then straight up full blown anxiety.
No, that's a great point. And exactly what you're saying is true. There is a difference between sadness and depression. There is a difference between kind of day-to-day worries and somebody who really has, say, a generalized anxiety disorder. And part of it is in how long those experiences last. Oftentimes If we're sad because things in our life make us sad, they make us sad for a period of time. If they are big things that make us sad, they might make us sad for a longer period of time.
Mhm.
But if the length of sadness goes on for a while, for a couple of weeks, and you have other things that go along with it, right? Like difficulty eating or sleeping, or difficulty concentrating, or maybe some thoughts of self-harm or dying, then you're thinking that's not just sadness, that's possibly depression. So I think that's right.
And
Yeah.
I think that kind of goes along with I think, and with the self-talk and positive self-talk and whatnot, is that I think that there's a time, where, like I said, not all this necessarily works. Like sometimes there needs to be some real assistance. Like I'm thinking about like, I tried to like sit in the corner and really think positive and all this stuff, but it's just not. And I don't know. I think in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's not really the prescription for you, in a sense that you might need some real help. I don't know.
Well, exactly. And some of the skills that I'm talking about are not, ones that we would intuitively think of. And so being in therapy with folks who are trained how to do this, they can teach these kinds of skills. And then for some, especially when there's a certain level of severity that's reached, some medication can be useful too. So a combination of medication for a mental illness and therapy can be really useful.
I love it. So I know I'm all over the place. I think when I kind of want to, and I'm probably going to jump around, but when did you start to think like really like, okay, in regards to all the things and the theories and even you as a practitioner, when did like, in regards to the positive self-talk and maybe DPT, when did this become like one is like, well, this is something that really resonates with me, because the reason why I was really attracted to having you on this podcast is when I heard you speak about it, it seemed like something that you use for yourself. I want you to use that story about how you kind of talked yourself through, boot camp and all that, but I'll let you go into that story.
Sure. Well, yeah, so actually that one, it's right. So when I was in the Army, I did have to learn how to talk to myself in a particular way. And that was before I had any of my training. So I guess I'm just glad I stumbled onto it. But I just learned at that point, especially as a woman in the Army, that I had to really pay attention to how I coached myself through these difficult experiences, because there are certainly enough messages, and especially back in the day when I was doing it, that, there were enough messages that would discourage me as a woman, that could I be successful as an officer in the Army? And I had to be able to talk to myself and say, yes, I can. And even though if people, men twice my size were doing these physical feats that would be challenging for me, I had to tell myself that there are ways that I can do this, and there are ways that I can be successful, maybe not in the way that they can, right? Like given my size, which I am small, and like, I'm not going to walk into the room and people will go, oh my gosh, you're this huge warrior. I had to distinguish myself in different ways and find my own ways to make a leadership impact. And so it was in navigating that experience that I do think just intuitively and personally, I realized how important it is how we talk to ourselves and how we coach ourselves to be successful.
So I think you spoke about it too, as like, I think that you had to address your identity, and also you even said it just now. I think we talked about this earlier. It's like, I think that sometimes the addressing of your identity also plays into this, right? Like the way that I talk about myself or to myself maybe be different to you as a white woman, and I'm a black male, that there can't be this prescribed way of doing it, but it's universally too. So like, can we talk about that dichotomy of like how positive self-talk may be universal, but then also different, or any of this well-being stuff may be different for different groups?
Sure. And this is a deep topic, so we'll see where we land with this.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. But I'm thinking that there's the potential, if we just in a vacuum say that if you talk to yourself in a positive way, then you can succeed, because that disregards so much context and so much history and so many of the challenges that, our individual differences bring. And so if I were to say, as a, just focusing on the identity of being a woman, if I just talk to myself positively, and then I will be able to succeed in any context where I'm competing with men, well, that does disregard some of the disadvantages historically that women have faced. And so, I mean, I'm not going to speak to your experience, Phil, but I imagine that there's some things that you could speak to as well, where, I mean, our context and our history does matter, and it's not just about self-talk. We have to appreciate the different ways in which, there are some real barriers that self-talk can't necessarily overcome.
Yeah, so I like that. I like the addressment of barriers. I like the, obviously and understanding that, but then at the same, it's like really hard for me to say that, because then I've also in addressing my identity or addressing my history, I found some resilience in that too. So it's kind of crazy, because I will, particularly think, like, when I think of tough, difficult situations, some of that self-talk is like, I don't know, like calling on the ancestors, like, oh, my dad could have done, my dad did this, and I've come to find out that my dad probably went through some tough situations that he didn't share with me, but other people have shared with me. But then I used to think about that, like, oh, but my dad did this, my dad was the only black man at VMI at a time, right? And he went through it, like, and so it's weird, like, it's an addressment of, barriers, but at the same time, it's like, I think in my mind, it's also giving me strength. But it is very difficult, because I still can't universally say my prescription of me looking at my ancestry could be the same for another black male. I don't know. Like, it's just so hard, because I really, really buy into well-being. I really practice it. I buy into it for myself. And sometimes I have to recognize that even though I buy into it for myself, that there's others that have, one, different barriers, or two, they don't do it the same as me.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, it's very difficult, because it's something like, it's almost like when you see it work for you, like this positive self-talk, when you see it really works for yourself, it's very hard not to want to spread it for someone else, but then understand that, like, maybe it's not applicable for everybody. I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's some contradictions, and, to kind of go back to like dialectics, like there's some things that we kind of have to hold as true at the same time, where, self-talk is important, but there are also other things like context and history that are important. And so, I mean, even if we were to, pick a different kind of identity, like if I were to, let's just take economic, placement in the world. Like if I'm talking to somebody who's differently placed in the world and they perhaps have more challenges, it would be invalidating for me to say to that person, just talk to yourself positively and you will overcome these barriers, without addressing actually the real life challenges that they have, perhaps in terms of housing insecurity and food insecurity. I can't like positively talk them out of that necessarily, right? There has to be some systemic changes that address that. So I think both are true.
Yeah. Wow. I think we're coming to like a real, I don't know. I think that's where this is where I'm also interested about that, is like, this is as we practice it out, because I think we both work with young people. We also just see, I don't know, it's just really hard. I'm still struggling with that, because when I say struggle, it's like sometimes you feel like I have the answers, like the answer is talk to yourself positively and see it work. See, look at me, like, and not to say like I got the best life, but I'm just saying, look at me. Like and even when you, like you are transparent and you self-disclose, look at my struggles, right? Look at my struggles, and I could do it if you could do it too. But then it's like, dang, at the same time, I don't know. We're not going to have an answer on this podcast, but I think that's at the core, the hard part about anything that's regarding positive and helping people is that it's like, it's good, but at the same time, you also know that, one, maybe not everyone is ready for it. Not everyone's ready to talk to themselves positively, but also I like what you said, knowing history and context, maybe not everyone has the access and resources to do it in the same way that I do it or you do it. And so I don't know. I think I want to find a way to make it, like not me make it, but like how we make it universal, but at the same time, make it individualistic, which is I guess, normal for life, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting thing. I mean, I can just tell you that one way that I think about it is that I think that it's, self-talk is important, but it's not the entire answer, right?
Yeah.
If there are some missing pieces, then it's not going to be helpful, in the way that we hope it would be. So if there are systemic changes needed, then self-talk is likely going to be still important, but potentially not enough.
Oh, okay. So it's like toolkit, your
Mm-hmm.
toolkit. You definitely, we had to really address multiple parts of that toolkit. And some of it is also your basic needs in that toolkit and some other things. What do you think would be some other things that we need to take into account when we're helping someone else in regards to that toolkit for in combination of that positive self-talk? I think we already addressed a couple, but what do you think are some other ones that
Mm-hmm.
we need to address for that toolkit?
Well, gosh, there's so many, but I will just tell you where my head just went in
Yeah.
terms of a clinical example, which is that when we think of people who benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy, which one component of it is to help folks learn how to engage in more effective self-talk. But
Mhm.
we know that if depression or anxiety is too high or they're too severe, CBT is only going to be helpful if it's also combined with medication, right? And so, that's a particular thing that has to happen in order. So that's just one clinical example of it. But, we talk about just even if we get outside of the clinical realm and we just think about how are we taking care of ourselves physically, if we're not sleeping well, then how we talk to ourselves isn't going to be as helpful as we want it to be. If we're not feeding ourselves well, if we're not exercising, if our physical well-being isn't strong, then our self-talk isn't going to be, how we shift that isn't going to be as powerful as we want it to be. So I think that it's one element of well-being, but it's not all of it.
Um, I don't know. I was like, while listening to that, and I was like, okay, that's one aspect. Can you take us through a story where I don't know, you just seen it like live like besides yourself,
Mm-hmm.
where someone really just bought into it that was of a different, I guess not identity, but someone from a different, yeah, like someone that you thought wouldn't buy into positive self-talk, and they really like you seen their transformation and you seen them grow through doing this, like someone that, kind of like a story or just a person, or I don't know. Like I love to hear stories where people like I tried it on someone and it worked. Like for instance, someone told me earlier, practice journaling, and I could be
Mm-hmm.
a testament to that. Now I'm like, now I got like 5 journals. I do it
Mm-hmm.
all the time. But someone that you saw like just really
Mm-hmm.
pick it up and really like, wow, they're a champion of this now because they've seen it work
Yeah.
in their lives.
Well, I guess I don't know how different from me they will be, but I do have a couple of stories that come to mind. One comes from when I was in the Army. So, before I was a therapist, and I was talking to one of my soldiers who had not gone to college and actually had the belief that he wouldn't be somebody who would be successful at college because he didn't think that he enjoyed books. And so that was a belief that he had, right? So that was a self-talk that he had. I am not going to be good at college. I'm not somebody who's good at reading. I don't enjoy books. Like that, those were the things going on in his mind. And so we just started talking. We were on some kind of exercise about one of the books that I particularly enjoyed from college, which was Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, give this a go. If you don't like it, give it back, whatever. Well, so he loved it. And then, so and then that sort of shifted because he had a different experience with
Mm-hmm.
reading. It shifted how he talked to himself. I actually am somebody who can enjoy reading. Oh, wait, this is a book that somebody studies in college. Maybe I can go to college. So I worked with him. This is 30 years ago. I got a message from him, on Facebook Messenger, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And he thanked me because he was then a college graduate. He remembered the book that I had given him, so I think that we can, in these small ways, be really impactful, even just by suggesting different experiences, because it can shift how people talk about themselves. So that's one story.
I love that. And then maybe this kind of leads to that. So I think now one thing that I've heard from that story is that not only did they believe in it, but they had to follow it up with a tangible action. And then that
Mm-hmm.
action reinforced that thought. So it's kind of like a cyclical thing, right? Like that the way you talk to yourself, then you act on those thoughts, then you're like, wow. And then you keep like, so I guess, I don't know, maybe in that cycle is like we have to take those positive self-talk into tangible little actions, which wasn't so grand. It wasn't like the positive self-talk was I can do this, and then I'm going to read a full thesis. It was like, let me just give one book a try or something like that, right?
Yeah.
How
Well,
does that
in
work?
CBT, we do that all the time. We call them experiments. So we have these beliefs, we have these automatic thoughts, and we don't necessarily tell people that's not true. We just say, well, can we test out possibly something that's different? And so in this case, even though I was not trained in CBT at the time, essentially I was saying, let's just test out the idea that you aren't a good reader. And gave him a book, and he's like, oh, wait, what? I am a good reader. And I like this, and maybe I'll. So he did this experiment. It gave him some new information. He developed some new thinking. It led down a different path.
I love that. So maybe even with the experiment, if I could take it to a further level, is that, even with experiments, you got to do multiple trials. So maybe even that thing, it could have like not backfired, but it might have been that one book might have been a book. He might have been like, all right, you didn't like Frankenstein. How about try Dracula? You know what I'm saying? Like, and you might have to try like a couple books, but like you do little experiments like, okay, maybe that one action. But I think the only thing that I had to, I guess, that's up to fate or whatever, is that still though within those actions, he needs to get like nuggets of a positive experience.
Yes,
so
yes.
hopefully when we do that positive self-talk, we do something that's aligned that has like a percentage chance to have some positive outcome, right? Like, or like then that
I think you might be a CBT therapist, Phil, because I mean, when we help our clients design experiments, we are hoping that they will have some kind of a positive experience, because we don't want to set them up for failure, right? But something that will lead. But you're right. If for whatever reason the experiment fails, then we don't say that the entire thing has failed. We say, let's try something different.
What's the variable? Like what's the variable? What's the control? Like a scientist, I think well-being, and I like to call myself the mad scientist of well-being, is the same thing. Like the not one size fits all. It's like, what was the variable that you didn't like? Try something else. You keep on going until eureka, you got the magic experiment. I don't know. Maybe we could think about that. I'm trying to think, because even today, I remember, we had our training for work today, and I think that I'm really action oriented. Was like, try to leave a student with at least one tangible action. And so I think that even beyond this, if we're working with someone, I think even with the positive self-talk, I was like, I'm gonna try to even focus that too. Is like, okay, talk to yourself nice, but then also try to follow up that talk to yourself nice with at least one action that you can use from that thought. So I don't know, like, I'm not a good public speaker. Well, talk in a meeting. That's like, like that could be your public speaking, not a speech, but talk up in a meeting or something like that. Like, really try to hone in on that negative talk, and then a positive talk, and then a positive action with hopefully a likelihood of a good outcome.
Yeah. And, in CBT, sometimes we don't even work on the thought first. We just work on the action. And because how we think about things can shift after the behavior. So, and I will just give you an example of something from my own history really quickly, which is that, I didn't speak up, as an undergraduate in classes. And so I had this, thought about myself that I wasn't somebody who could speak up in classes. But in graduate school, I forced myself to, right? In graduate school, I'm like, I will raise my hand 3 times and speak up in this class, whether I have something sensical to say or not. And I did. I didn't believe I could. I just did it. And then after I kept doing it, then I realized, actually, I can say things in class, and, I can make contributions. So my belief actually changed after I forced my behavior change.
I like that. So, okay. So maybe my last point of that too, but it was like, 1, you made it actionable, and 2, it didn't seem like super overwhelming. Like, I'm gonna speak up really loud and stand up. It was like very simple, like 3 times or something like that. So
now for me, that was challenging. For somebody who's an extrovert, that might have been challenging.
Okay. Let me try. Yeah, because I was about to say like 3 times, and then I had to like limit myself to once. No, but I was trying to say, for like, even when I was saying not the 3 times, I'm talking about like, it wasn't like I'm going to get in front of the class every time I talk, face the class, and it's like you made it like manageable.
Yeah.
And that was the word I was trying to go with, the scenario. Yeah, definitely. Because now when if I ever take a class, I'm gonna just stand up every single time for no reason. See what people say. I should try that. I should randomly try that next time in a class. Like, when I speak, just stand up for no reason, even if it's just a simple question, and then sit down and see if people look at me funny. But I don't know. I think I have like one more gem, one more thing in gem, but I think you've been dropping lots of gems. I think one more thing I wanted to touch upon until we kind of wrap up this show is like we're experiencing a very difficult situation. And so I think I want to leave the listeners with some tips. I think that you gave some great tips. So like maybe for those that are listening and they're like, okay, I need to write this down. What would be some tangible tips that you would help them, not help them, but like you would say, practice this as experiments for yourself when you're going through a tough time? Maybe, I don't know, just simple things, maybe to stand up 3 times. I don't know. What are some practical things that you think you would tell someone that I'm going through a really tough time? Try these couple things.
Sure. Yeah. And I think when you're talking about tough times, I mean, we've had such a tough year and a half, right? For so many different reasons.
I'd just say the blanketed tough time, like not like very targeted that they lost a friend or, I'm talking about just globally, I'm tired, kind of that kind of tough time. Like
right. Exactly. There's a lot of that, right?
Yeah. Like a generalized tough time, not like a super traumatic, specific one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess 2 thoughts come to mind. One is I think that however we can find a way to hold on to hope, and that can look like different things for different people. What is it that gives us hope? I'm a mom and I do look at my kids and they give me a lot of hope. So I think that trying to find hope wherever we can, even in small moments, is useful. A second thing that I would say is that when we're going through difficult times, we can be really influenced by our emotions and our feelings. And that can really influence the decisions we make and the behaviors we engage in after those feelings. But rather than having our feelings dictate what we do, if we can be clear about who we are as people and what our values are, then that can be kind of our North Star, our guide to our behavior, even if we're kind of influenced by these, swells and waves of feeling. They don't have to knock us off course as long as we know who we are as people and what our values are, and we follow that direction.
I love it. I think that I was just smiling because I think about that too. Like, I wrote down who I am at the core, and then like I try to hold on to it. Like even if I'm having a terrible day, I'm like, I think I'm funny, or at least I think I am.
And you are.
And then I just crack jokes about myself, and then like even just find humor in just terrible things that are probably not that funny in the moment, but to me, I'm like, I'm laughing like a crazy person.
You got a gift there, Phil.
Yeah, that's the thing I hold on to. So I love that, like your core values. So I kind of lied. I actually said that was my last thing. But if you're a listener of the show, I do a thing called Shot for Shot. You get to ask any random question. I get to ask a random question. Do you want to go first? I'll go first.
Oh my gosh. So I get to ask you a random question?
Yeah, not even related to this. I just love doing that. Just throwing me off guard. Makes me think.
All right.
And I
don't know if it will make you think or not, but who do you think is funny?
Oh, like who I think is funny? Okay, yeah. So can I do like a real scenario? Like not a real, like a famous person, and then famous person, I think, just can go to the Hall of Fame of comedians. I actually still like to watch stand-ups. So I love Martin Lawrence, I love Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, Kevin Hart, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy. I still like to watch those old stand-ups, and they're still funny. And they make me laugh. Yeah. I think humorous, and I don't give her enough credit, but my wife makes me laugh really, really hard. I think my best friend Hillard and my best friend Marcus are people that give me just normal, like organic belly laughs like anyone else. Like the way they tell stories. I don't know. Sometimes my wife, she could just make me laugh really hard. My best friend Marcus, he actually but he does amateur stand-up sometimes, and he actually practices his stand-up, like his routine he's really good at it, but he was actually just good at it just being himself. So I like to see that he actually put work into that craft. And then my best friend Hillard, the way they make me laugh, I think he's just, I don't know, man. Like sometimes we laugh, me and him chuckle like we're still in high school, like little kids, like the stupidest stuff, like people falling, or like like dumb things that are just dumb. He'll send me memes during work, and he knows that they'll make me laugh. And And it's like this sense of humor where like he can send me something, and I think he knows that uniquely it's only funny to us two, because I literally could show that same thing and I might get like a huh, that's not that funny. But to me and him, that humor, I think that's what really bonded us. Like we both think it's hilarious. And so I really connected with him. So those are my personal people and like celebrities, you know.
That's great.
All right. I got one. So you did say what gives you hope, and I actually want to, now I'm actually going to put you on the spotlight. I loved it. Number 2. So what, if you got three, I guess, North Stars, what are, they could be one word descriptors of yourself, or they can be whatever you could, they could be whole phrases. I don't care. But what are your three North Stars? And, you know, I also like to believe that sometimes your North Stars change as you grow, like your values change. So I'm going to use this one, like right now. What are your North Stars? Because I was like, you know, like this is something like I believe is, you know, core to me right now.
Yeah. So as you're asking that question, I'm thinking about actually values and what help ground me. And so one would be relationships. I actually think of relationships as a kind of spirituality. You know, that's where I find a lot of meaning and purpose is in my relationships, particularly with my family, but in all relationships. Authenticity. And I think, you know, I love listening to Brene Brown, and she's got a whole discussion around values. I think embedded in authenticity is courage. And so I'll put that in there too. And then a third one would be kindness.
Hey, I was about to say I think that's one of mine too. Like the being nice to people, and also just like not like fake. Let me rephrase, not like fake nice, like legit, like you genuinely want people to feel good. That makes me happy. So hey, shout out to kindness. I was about to say, that's definitely one that that's one of my cores is kindness. And then really, actually, I'd like to say that too. I think people, I'm an extrovert, so I think relationships are really big for me. I think in regards to, you like to say the connectedness, but I like to say with the not resources, but just the overall growth of myself is through relationships. So I think that's really one of my cores too. Good relationships, obviously.
Yes, exactly.
Oh man! All right. Well, that's been great. I definitely want to respect your time. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the part of the show I call it Shoutouts and Plugs. So shoutouts, you get to show any love to anyone you want to show love to. I don't care. And then plugs will be any way or the listeners can follow up with you or things that you're working on, at which I'll definitely put in the show notes so that they can connect with you or learn from you just as much as I learned from you. So the stage is set. Shoutouts and plugs, all yours.
All right. Well, Phil, I got a shout out to you. I mean, so I've learned from you too. And so thank you so much. I'm going to shout out to my kids who, Molly, Jackson, and Megan are just truly, and my husband, Mike, are just like the lights of my life. And I learn and laugh with them all the time. We were talking about this a little bit before, like I have to shout out my dissertation advisor, Dave Haga, who is funny. So you would appreciate that. He's actually the most hilarious person I've ever met in academia or maybe anywhere. And he's truly the most brilliant person I've met. So shout out to Dave, who I think shaped a lot of my professional life. Plugs. So, I did mention that I'm working on my leadership coaching. And so in addition to the work I do in higher education, I work in my company, Mindful Vantage. And so I do have that website, and I can be found on LinkedIn with that too.
Excellent. And I forgot to do a random plug, but she's also has done my life goal. She can add to her tagline a TedX speaker, which I just randomly going to put that in the show notes just because that's pretty dope. And so you're public speaker, so maybe now you're going to get all kinds of speaking gigs, and I'll ride your coattails and you put me on.
All right, Phil.
That was dope. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. I think the listener, I definitely, as you can see, I was taking notes. For me, this podcast is not only a learning opportunity for my listeners. But honestly, this has always been a great way for me to learn new things. And I've definitely learned some new things from you today. So I really, really appreciate that. This is great.
Likewise, this has been a lot of fun, and I learned from you too, Phil.
Thank you so much. So, listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your family and friends. That's how this positivity spreads. As well as if you have a message for the podcast, you can call the hotline, which is 571-336-6560. Leave a message on the podcast. That'd be great. Sometimes I play them in the podcast. But this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for listening, and we're out. Thank you for listening to Positive Philter, a podcast that focuses on family, friends, career, with a little self-help along the way. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, and like the Facebook page, Spreading Positivity Movement. Thanks for listening.